Another play.
Okay. So it is a pleasure, not least because it's a little bit over 40 years since I set foot in this department. This building didn't exist. And the only remaining people in the room that I can identify are Julia and Mira. And I was ushered in by two people who are not here right now. One is Tanya Reinhardt, the other one is Ruth Berman. איך אומרים, תיבדל לחיים. Okay, so let's start. So there's a economic historian who won the Nobel Prize last December by the name of Joel Mokyr, who's kind of semi-local and is actually giving a lecture here in about 10 days in Barshira or something like this, which, having seen quite a few of his lectures on YouTube, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. He seems not only an amazing intellectual, but also the nicest man on earth, something like this. And I highly, highly recommend it. It's going to be in Hebrew. And his interest is in the industrial revolutions in England that started in the late 18th century. And one of the things that he points to as just about the beginning of the industrial revolutions is something that's called the Lunar Society of Birmingham. Anybody heard about this? Okay, so the Lunar Society was a meeting point, a monthly meeting point on a full moon between industrialists, engineers, and scientists, what was used to be called natural philosophers. And to him, this is like the very, like the launching pad of the industrial revolutions. These people realize that there must be an exchange between people who make things and people who know things. He calls it the interaction between savants and fabricants. And he really describes it at great detail, and it's amazing. And the people there are people that some of you may have heard of. Okay, so there are people like Joseph Priestley, who's one of the first chemists ever. There are people like James Watt, like Watts that used to be in lamps. He's the inventor of the steam engine. And people like Josiah Wedgwood, who is of Wedgwood Ceramics. I don't know how many of you are interested in porcelain, but Wedgwood Ceramics is like a well-known, probably the first British firm that could beat the Chinese in the quality of ceramics at that period of time. And to me, it's something that we must learn from. So if you want, there's something about this lecture that's kind of a little bit scratching the surface of a bunch of issues. It has a little bit of a pontificatory tone to it. It's how we should behave. And by we, I'm trying to be one of we, in some sense. So let's see where it takes us. So here's the questions that I'm sure that all of you have heard of. One of them is how come that we, what do we know when we know language? Issues of the theory of knowledge of some sort. Question number two is how did we come about? How does this knowledge come about? How did it get into our heads? By injection, by operation, by something. The third one is what exactly happens in our brains when we do this kind of stuff. And the fourth one that I added, not arbitrarily, I think, is how do we build good machines that can speak like us or something like that? And the important thing about question number four, and I keep emphasizing it, and I highly recommend to anyone, is that this is not a scientific question. It's an engineering question. It can turn into a scientific question, but as is, it's not. And I think it's really important to set it up in this way. You may identify kind of like remnants of questions that were asked in a famous article by Chomsky and Miller, or Miller and Chomsky in the 1960s. It's like setting off a program of how to study language, but this was not there. Nobody could possibly imagine this would ever be there. So here's what we're going to do, and it's a little, not just a little, but more than a little inspired by this book. There's several things that we're going to go over. I'm going to start by talking about an old puzzle about language and learning, put two current extreme positions. Somebody told me years ago that a good story can only exist if there's a conflict. Okay, so let's see conflict. And then we're going to look a little bit in detail. It's going to be kind of scratching the surface, but each of you is welcome either to ask me questions or to read on his or her own later on. And maybe I'm going to put a little bit of an emphasis on something that I know a little bit about, which is neurolinguistics, and let's see. I think I have an agenda. It's not a new agenda, but the idea is like small linguistic neural systems. This is the neural networks, if you will. This is the right thing to do, I think. And we'll talk about that a little later. So this is the first thing. I don't know how many of you have read Meno, Plato's Meno, but I used to teach in this university, I used to teach a course that's called Introduction to Cognitive Science. This was in 1986 or 7 or 8, or something like this. And the first article that the students read was Meno, and I highly recommend that all of you read it. And the reason I like it, it's not because it's a good Platonic dialogue and it's intelligent, but it's the first, to my mind, at least to my knowledge, it's the first psychology experiment that was ever done on Earth. And the story, whoever of you remember, is a debate on whether virtue, how do we know, how can we identify virtue if you're not virtuous? That's the paradox. How can we learn anything if we don't have the tools by virtue of which we learn? Okay, so the debate between Meno and Socrates, who are the main debaters, is let's find out. And here's an experiment. Supposedly you take a tabula rasa, it's a slave boy who knows nothing. That's the metaphor for zero knowledge. And let's see if this slave boy can prove the Pythagorean theorem. Now, one thing that's a little special about the Pythagorean theorem, some of you may remember from 8th grade or something, is that you need to have some kind of a construction. You need to take the diagonal and construct a square on top of it. So there's like a little bit of a creative leap. And what he shows is that actually the slave boy can do it. That's the story there. And I always gave it to the students as a way to show that psychological experiments are not new. And there's nothing novel about the history of psychology. And I honestly highly recommend it. So now the question is, can we bear on this debate in a slightly more, a way that's a little bit more raffiné, as you might say. And maybe, so here are side by side the two heroes of the story. One is Chomsky, who says that, yeah, you need symbolic rule systems of one sort or another. And critically, there is some innate knowledge that's required. Some, I don't know how much. And the second heroes is mostly Jeff Hinton, just because he's more vocal than the others. But I think the three heroes are the winners of the Turing Award from 2018, Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, and Yoshua Benjo, who won it for a variety of inventions and creations and ideas and leadership qualities. And Hinton later proceeded to win the Nobel Prize in Physics. And they, of course, as all of you know, they have claimed that, in fact, functionality is attained on input statistics alone, experience alone, nothing else. And the models are probabilistic, they're not symbolic. Okay, to the extent that we really, really understand the difference between these two. So this is like you get a conflict, and let's see whether we can actually decide, but let's see how they talk about each other. It's kind of telling. So this is probably the last written document that we have from Chomsky from over 3 years ago. As all of you know, he had a stroke, and he's not just a physics. It seems that he's a little bit beyond the physics, but I'm not quite sure. And he said the human mind is not like ChatGPT and its ilk, a lumbering statistical engine for pattern matching, gorging on hundreds of terabytes of data and extrapolating the most likely conversational response or most probable answer to a scientific question. Okay, that's what he said. Hinton, and I'm quoting something that's very mild because he called Chomsky crazy and things like that. About an hour after he was told that he won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel website has fantastic things that make scientific endeavors exciting to young people or to anybody, actually. And if you haven't been there, I highly recommend that you go visit this site. It's an incredible website. And one thing they do is about half an hour to an hour after the announcement, which you know is dramatic, they call you right after the Swedish Academy made the decision, regardless of where you are on the globe. And he would happen to be in California. He said he was in a cheap hotel, but I don't know exactly how cheap it was, but it was a hotel. And the guy interviewed him, and at one of the interviews, of course, about what it feels like to win a Nobel Prize, and Hinton at the end said, well, he asked him, so will something change now? And he said, well, I think people might start taking me seriously. And the interviewer said, you mean people are not taking you seriously? And he said, well, there's this guy named Chomsky, and there's this school of linguistics, but I can tell you that neural nets are much better at processing language than anything ever produced by the Chomsky School of Linguistics. You have to listen to it, I swear, go there. I think it's called First Impressions or First Reactions Interview. It's there. I have many, many YouTube hours with this guy. So this is what he had to say, okay? Like being at the top of the world. But anyway. So here's what I want to do. I want to get a little bit more detail. So let's talk about mutual complaints. And the mutual complaints go like this. First, there is an empirical complaint leveled at linguistic theory, and it says linguistic theory is not runnable. I say here it fails miserably on being runnable on a machine, whereas large language models succeed beautifully. I'm now using large language models, not AI, but large language models, transformer technologies and such. Okay. And I can tell you something actually interesting about runnability. There's a lot to be said, but one reason why computational linguists, by and large, not in this group. I know that Ronnie has a lab here and he has students, and I'm sure that his students are as good as they ever come, and they're almost unique. But with an exception, I think, of maybe 3 labs throughout the world, Ronnie's lab, Emmanuel Schemlaz, maybe Tal Linsen's, people who came from this program, this Mitztainim program or something. And with very few exceptions, most computational linguists don't know linguistics at the level of Ling 101. They just don't. And there's a reason. At least I have a hypothesis about this kind of stuff. So for years, I used to follow the syllabi of courses in LLP. Let's see what they teach there, okay? So at the beginning, they used to relate, at the beginning, I mean, let's say 15 years ago. So linguistic knowledge used to be harmful knowledge. You were warned not to take a linguistics course. I'm serious. Too bad I never kept it, and I should have built a little archive. I like archives, so I should have built one for this, and I never did. But you can actually warn about this. And then later on, it went like this. Slide 1. There's this thing called linguistics, and there was this guy named Chomsky. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Wow, what a sentence. Wow, it shows the syntax and semantics are not the same. Slide 2. Well, but later on, it didn't really work. And here's the proof. Fred Jelinek, who was a very, very respectable speech scientist at IBM, said the following: every time I fire a linguist, the performance of the system goes up. I'm sure that most of you have heard about this. He later denied it, actually. He being Fred Jelinek, he later denied it. He was an interesting character in his own right, but it doesn't matter. This is the legend that lived on. And from that slide, namely from slide 3 on, you're free to start with the equations. Probabilistic equations, this and that. This is how it works. And you are completely absolved from knowing anything about this discipline that's called linguistics. Anyway, but the important thing is not just that something was abandoned, but actually what was adopted. And what was adopted and is taken very seriously by by two articles that I think are extremely foundational by Rosa Cow and Dan Yammins from Stanford, and I highly recommend that you read them, is the requirements, what makes a functional, a theory of the functioning brain, what makes it a theory? And one of the requirements, and there's a whole story of it, but one of the requirements is that it would be runnable on a machine. And this is one of the criteria. And it's not such a bad criterion, except I'm not so sure that would make it so high in my priority. It's a pretty good thing, let's see if it has good predictions, if it works, but who said that this is the ultimate desideratum, So this is something to keep in mind because these things are extremely high on the list of complaints that are leveled about linguistics, And people, yes.
I think there is a reason behind it, being that these people are mostly empiricists. And as empiricists, they admire the idea of tabula rasa.
I don't know. I don't want to call them names because the variety of people who believe in this is really broad. There's all kinds of people who say this.
You're right, but
and again, you will find many linguists who are empiricists as well.
I'm not from this department.
So I'm not, in a sense, the reason I'm disagreeing with you is because in a way it doesn't matter. What matters is what it is. I don't want to go too deep into anyone's psychology or even epistemology, as long as we can weigh their arguments against ours or something like that. So you may be right to some extent. You meet all kinds of people.
No, what I was trying to say is there is it's not a specific thing that they say. There is a philosophy behind it. That's what I'm trying to.
But I disagree with you. Let me continue. I'll be happy to take up the challenge. I disagree with you. It's yet another property that you would expect your theory to have, that it gives you good predictions. And you like any theory to have good predictions. The question is what weight you put to good, you ascribe whatever you do to weight with respect to other kinds of considerations, theoretical considerations. This is what you guys learn. That's what you study. So anyway, so this is one thing. So one complaint is that linguistic theories are not runnable. The second complaint is that linguistic theory fails to make itself implementable in a brain. So the building blocks of the theory, all these symbols, lambda expressions, whatever, what do they have to do with brains? That's the intuition behind it, and it's easy to use intuition when you try to make somebody dismiss something, okay? So the brain is made up, of course it's made out of neural networks. And of course the brain is a prediction machine. So, anything that's not a prediction machine or is made out of a neural network is no good. We have prediction machines that are good. That's the claim. I spent, I'm at something called ELSEG, the Safa Center of Brain Science at the Hebrew University. Everybody around me believes in this. Everyone. And they're smart people. They're not stupid at all, but they all believe in this. Okay, so here is things that we might consider. Do we really understand what these prediction machines do? So suppose they predict everything. Do we really understand what they're doing? Answer, and it's coming out of somebody who's among the most serious neural network students. Ilya Sutskever, who started his career at the Open University in Ra'anana and left quickly to Toronto. And then he was one of the most prominent students of Jeff Hinton at the University of Toronto. And he's part of the famous AlexNet, if you may have heard about it. It's like considered as the turning point of the neural networks revolution in 2012. And he said in one of his lectures, he said, to predict the next token well enough means that you understand the underlying reality that led to the creation of that token. So building a machine that can predict it's not what he should have said. What he should have said, to build a machine that predicts the next token. That's what he did. He built a machine that can predict the next token. So you might argue what exactly is understanding here.
I disagree again. We call, I think. I'm sorry, the question.
Oh, it's okay. I can.
But we.
You know what? Let's
time frame for the talk.
I'll be
Half an hour for questions and it works well.
We'll do it later. I'm an argumentative guy, so he knows it. So he keeps me.
I'm too. So,
No.
yeah.
Oh, really? You're nah. This is the first time I ever hear.
But, you know.
Okay. So
full hour.
yeah. Okay. So basically, the way these people work, this is like to anticipate a little bit. What you do is you give strings of words, and then you ask a machine or a human. I'll make it a little clearer later. This is just like the preamble, what's coming. You give somebody a text, and then you ask a human or a machine to predict the next word, and then you can check it against what's called a ground truth, which is what the word really was. And you can have a moving window and play these games, and you can actually convert these into quantities, namely probabilities. How many people out of 5,000 predicted this word to be Brazil? The sentence here is, our story begins deep in the rainforests of Brazil comes up first, okay? So you can give a number, how many out of my 5,000 subjects did it right, and then you can look at the numbers that you can read off the machine a little bit just before the word is presented to this machine, and you can compare and see such things. That's part of the game that's being played. Okay, so they understand, they claim they understand, and I think to my mind, justified critique, and we're going to talk about it later, is that this understanding should come in with a very big question mark. Here are a couple of other things, which you might call empirical critiques of large language models. One thing is that they're too strong, and you can find embarrassingly silly instances. Really, it's so silly that it's embarrassing to even say it, that large language models succeed beautifully where we fail, and this is like triple center embeddings and beyond, things like that. And the reason I mention it here is because this actually has something a little bit beyond just catching the machine on some failure. There's something that goes a little deeper than that. Another thing is that these things are opaque. So performance improves over time, but why? And it's very difficult to say almost ever why there was a change between ChatGPT 4 point something and 5 point something. It's just very, very difficult to try even to articulate the question. So Danny Fox, who you probably know, in one of our conversations let's call it the GPTN problem. And the way it works is that I've presented it a million times to neuroscientists, and they all say, well, what would you say if the next ChatGPT would get it? So, okay, so it's like there's always some promising end somewhere down the line. So, of course, the answer to this is really easy. And the answer is, well, first of all, show me the money. Just give me ChatGPT N such that it gets this example. And secondly, more importantly, do we really understand what happened between ChatGPT N and ChatGPT N plus M, or something like this? And we'll show you a couple of cases. And then it turns out that LLMs actually use cheat sheets. It's actually very funny. They do use cheat sheets. So if you look at it, you will see that the reason the performance improves, I was lucky to hit upon a couple of cases which I tested in 2023 and then in 2025. And I could compare the answers. And I can tell you already the reason, and you'll see it for yourselves, okay? They swallowed Hyman Kratzer. This is exactly it, or some version thereof, okay? You can see it, it takes no genius to see this. Okay. And we will see this like parallelism, or some version of parallelism, something like this. the last thing, which hopefully we'll get to, because this is really something I actually know a little bit about, is all kinds of biological things. I would try to show you that it doesn't really work in the language domain. So we'll set our standards by looking at vision, which I think is an area where neural networks are amazingly advanced and fantastic and scientific and whatever you want. We look at that, and then we'll move to phonetics, which is equally good, I think. And then we'll ask the question is, why don't we see the same kind of stuff in syntax and semantics? And it's shocking. It really is shocking. You know, I stopped being shocked because I've been in this swamp for long enough, but it's still shocking. And then maybe if we have time, we'll look if LLMs can be used to help somebody. All right. So what I'll try to convince you eventually is that there's a very simple slogan, which is complex to implement, but I think it's right, which is what we need to realize is that in this brain, there's pieces of linguistic knowledge, and they live in designated pieces of brain, like neural pieces. And the trick is to define correctly what linguistic knowledge pieces are and what the brain pieces are. And I have my own version, and I think there's evidence that supports it. I'm not alone in this. I have I'm like kind of dragging behind the world's best neuroanatomists. So that's it. All right, let's talk about empirical issues quickly. First of all, you try this machine with like 6 triple embeddings, 6, right? Yeah. You just put this question to the machine, and every time you get the same answer. It peels it like an onion. It's very easy. Now, of course, you can be analytic and do it yourself. It's just going to take you 2 hours, but this is a computer, so it's faster. This would be the answer. The answer is always, oh, come on. This is like a silly example, but it's not silly. And the reason is that in order for you to actually make it silly, you have to assume some kind of a performance system. But wait a second, I thought these people explicitly deny the distinction between competence and performance that we kind of live off. Oh. So it's not so stupid. It seems something that anyone who's taken at least what used to be a class in introductory linguistics, where they show you something about center embedding, right branching, things like that, and some contrast thereof, and they show you there's a real puzzle there, and maybe it has a solution, but the solution needs to rely on something like a distinction between the rules of the machine or the knowledge base of the machine and the implementation. You need to have it. These guys deny it completely. I'm sure that some of you have read this rhetorical paper by Stephen Piantadosi, who explicitly denies this stuff and who got 30,000 downloads in 6 months or something like this. I mean, I wish I got like 1% of this for anything I've ever written. And this is the kind of stuff that's there, a complete sweeping denial of that distinction between competence and performance. And there's a good reason for him to do that, because without this distinction, it's not so clear what's so special about this. Everybody believes that there's a memory or memories and that they're used and things like that. But the question is there anything like knowledge? And if you need to make a distinction between something that's called knowledge and something else, there goes your argument. So there's something a little deeper in this silly, embarrassingly silly example than actually meets the eye. So that's number one. Number two is something about Danny's GPT-N problem. Okay, so it used to be that in 2023, I asked this machine at the beginning of its career, I asked it something about structural ambiguities. I was a student in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there was a guy who Mira knew called Chaim Rosen. Oh. You didn't know him well. And Chaim Rosen used to think that he invented the world of structural ambiguities. So he had this thing called Chavrat HaKnesset HaRishona, the first parliament member. Okay, to me, it was a great revelation at the time. And maybe you remember this example. Okay. So I asked, something like the northern building scaffolding or something like this. I think I gave it as an example in a class. So I asked the machine, and yeah, it didn't identify it didn't recognize the ambiguity. Okay, then you try 3 years later. Fantastic. 2026, it identifies it. But then you try to ask or reflect or trace. Again, I'm not a computer guy. I haven't done my homework in this respect, but I asked some people. What I can do is ask others. And I don't think anyone knows why specifically. There's no way that you can provide a causal explanation for why the machine is so good now, other than it's so big. It's got lots of GPUs, So my daughter's boyfriend works at NVIDIA, so I like this kind of stuff. It's good business for him. Okay, but other than that, I don't understand. So it's important to remember that when the machine gets it, when ChatGPT plus M gets it, it's not a victory. It's success, and it's a nice success, but it's not a victory because the burden is on you who endorses this as a great score to explain why. And this is something that I believe is taught in this department. But this is the burden is on you. Okay, here's a second one. Second one, I'll just go over this quickly. So the second one has this like strict slopey ambiguity, and you can have the picture, those of you who can't identify. One is like the slopey ambiguity in which each of them walks his or her own dog. And the reason you focus on such things is obvious, because you want to predict the next guy, then you want to look for places where there are empty categories and there's an ambiguity nested within them or something like this. And this is a good case to look at. Okay, so you ask yourself, is the sentence, John walked his dog and so did Mary and Bill, is it ambiguous? And then the other meaning, so we answer, yes, it is ambiguous between a slopey reading and a strict reading in which all three of them walked John's dog. Okay, that's kind of easy. And you ask the machine, and the machine, I'm sorry, it's too small, but I can tell you the machine gets it beautifully. This is like 2 years ago, whenever I looked for this. And then you move on and you say, but wait a minute, is this constrained? Because one thing is that the strict sloppy ambiguity is constrained by some kind of parallelism of sorts. So here's a possibility. Let's ask the machine, is it possible that in the sentence, John walked his dog and so did Mary and Bill, that this sentence also means that Bill walked Mary's dog? And of course, humans say no, because it violates parallelism. But this sentence, the reason you want to use 3 potential antecedents is to distinguish between the possibility that they're strict and sloppy, accounting for all the possible interpretations, but there's no third way. So you put in a third antecedent, a third potential antecedent, which opens the way to many other interpretations, and then you can exclude all of them. So didactically, it's kind of good to present this when you teach VP ellipsis. So this is a possibility that Bill and Mary walked Mary's dog and John walked John's dog. This is the question, and we say no. At the time, the machine said, I apologize for any confusion in my previous responses. You're correct, and I misspoke. The sentence it is indeed possible that Bill walked Mary's dog. So it accepted it, and it's like hand programmed to apologize profusely, and it did. Great. So this was in GPT-N, which we fixed at 2023 in this case. Okay, and what's happened in GPT-N plus K is that I asked in more detail, because all kinds of people said, well, maybe they actually own the same dog and they walked it sequentially. So I like to do experiments. So I ruled every possibility I ruled out by this little paragraph. Each of them owns a different dog, and they walked on different days of the week, blah, blah, blah. And then I asked, is it possible that in fact you get a violation of parallelism? And after 34 seconds, it says short answer, no. But here's the smoking gun. Okay. it answers you an answer that has a lambda expression. So now that actually several possibilities. Possibility one that Ronnie actually pointed out to me about 6 months ago, and he said, well, it could be that the reason the machine responded no is divorced from the reasoning that the machines had for saying no. Like anything is possible. And I said, look, in principle, maybe, I don't know, but this is even worse. It's even worse. So it could be that the machine is inconsistent in such a crazy way. It's even worse. But what's more important here, whether or not it's consistent or inconsistent, it's kind of unlikely that it invented lambda expressions on its own, just on the basis of its training set. It's not very likely. More likely it is that somebody force-fed it with Hyman Kratzer or something like this. So you have a smoking gun right here. It's an extremely impressive endeavor to take what you were fed on Monday and use it to interpret something that you got on Thursday. It's an extremely fantastic achievement. I'm not poo-pooing it for a single second, but this is not science, it's fantastic engineering. Some might say, actually, it's not so fantastic engineering because now each of these machines comes with a nuclear reactor in tow. You know, actually, a friend of mine, my closest colleague in Jerusalem, a physicist, a guy named Jonathan Devenstein, calls me up and he said, I got really embarrassed by ChatGPT. I couldn't prove some theorem. And I asked it and it did it in 5 seconds. Well, if you read Scott Aronson's blog, you can see such experiences all over the place. And I told him, I don't think you should be embarrassed because I don't know where there's a hookup in your body. But if you connect the nuclear reactor, you'd also solve it in 5 seconds. So it's not even clear that from an engineering point of view, it's such a feat because it's very difficult. I could never be an engineer. It's so hard. But again, it's now getting to the point where it would consume more energy resources than the world has. So maybe we should reconsider. I'm not saying it's bad, but maybe there's an alternative or partial alternative. All right, let's go to the biology and then I'll be done, almost done. I want you to see the standards in vision science. And this is an old paper. It's a paper from 2007 that came out of Tommy Poggio's lab at MIT. And these guys started, Tommy Poggio and his generation, they really started out in the world of symbolic computation. Shimon Ullman, people like that. They started off in the world of symbolic computation and they shifted. And they shifted it because it was right for them to shift, because the talk about neural networks, they could actually put some content in these units and make them a little bit similar to neurons. And when it came to connectivity, they built connectivity. I think this is a convolutional network. I'm not sure, but maybe.
Yes.
What?
Probably yes.
Probably. I think and probably yes. Okay. So it looks like a convolutional one, something like this. And the point here is you can actually equate each of the steps in the computation and the connectivity with some kind of pathway that you identified in I think this is a monkey or cat, I don't remember. You can actually identify it. And what that means is that you can actually get specific predictions for level of activation in each of these nodes and then go test it in the cat's brain. This is serious. It really is, and I hope you're duly impressed. I mean, the models today, especially those that come out of the lab that this Dan Yamins I quoted earlier was a student of at Jim DiCarlo's lab at MIT. These are amazing predictions that they have, and these things pan out in specific measures. It's not some kind of a wild guess. And this was a feed-forward network, something way before the transformers, but it doesn't matter. It's good modeling, good prediction setup, and good experimentation. And this is the standard that we should require. So please keep it in mind. Here's another one coming out of Kalanit Grid-Spector's lab at Stanford. And it shows you that there are all aspects of faces versus places. This is like by now a fairly well-known distinction in certain parts of the human brain called the fusiform. You can see that extremely detailed, fine properties of objects, of being a face versus not being a face, of being a place and not being a place, things like that, which seem to have some kind of a theoretical interpretation in a functional theory, have very precise and consistent brain regions if you do your experiments right. These are serious things. So this is like, the anatomy of object recognition. So this is the standard that we should strive for. Here's another thing. One of the most charming papers I've ever read in linguistics, okay? So there's a group in San Francisco headed by a guy named Eddie Chang, who's a neurosurgeon, who has an incredible talent to select good people to help him. He knows how to work in big groups and how to conduct them. And he does experiments with epileptic patients. So these are patients who have epileptic foci, like zap generating foci somewhere in the brain that's not controllable by medication. So you have to resect them somehow. And in order to resect them, what you do, this is a technique that developed in the early 1990s. You open the patient's skull and you insert a matrix of electrodes that sit on a piece of silicone. You insert them there and you pull out a wire that has a small wire connected to each of these electrodes. And then you can test the patient. You can test the patient for about a week. For about a week until the real surgery comes, and you can see the functionality of each of those tiny regions. And the reason to do it is because we know something about the brain map for language, but there's a lot of individual variability, and this is an individual patient with his or her individual problem and locations, and you want to study something about it. So many of these patients agree to also put in some experimental materials, and Keith Johnson from UC Berkeley gave them a bunch of sentences with a whole inventory of phonemes in the English language, and he gave it to them recorded in several voices. I don't know, as they might have objections of some sort, I don't know, but to me it looked like a quite exhaustive set of sentences. Each of them got like 500 sentences read in female and male voices, and they were different. And then they had this amazing engineer, Nima Mesgarani, they had him analyze it. This is very noisy data. You have to apply all kinds of AI-based algorithms to extract the signal from the noise. And something amazing turned out. First of all, it turned out that there's certain specific electrodes. So you see here, there was like 102 electrodes or something like that. So each electrode specializes in something. So this is like an example of 5 electrodes. Knowing how these things work, they probably picked for the panel, they probably picked the best ones. But they did the statistics. So you can see this electrode specializes and it reacts more strongly to something than other electrodes, and each of them is a specialist. But what's interesting is not that. This is in auditory cortex, okay? What's interesting is not that. What's interesting is the grouping. And it turns out that electrodes don't specialize in particular phonemes. They specialize in something abstract. It's called distinctive features. To me, it was really mind-boggling, completely mind-boggling. If you want, they asked me at the time to write a commentary. And I took Eli Melken, who knows much more about auditory cortex than I ever will, and we wrote this together. And the one point I made is that, isn't it amazing that you had Roman Jakobson and Nikolai Trubetskoy set up distinctive features in the mid-1930s, and here comes these guys, I can read them off cortex. To me, it was sci-fi, honestly. I was really beside myself when I read this paper, and it was expressed in that little comment that we made. So this is the standard. That's the minimum standard. And let's look what happens. Okay, so here, most superior temporal gyrus electrodes are selective not to individual, but to specific groups of phonemes that represent abstract phonological distinctive features. I think it was dramatic. There's been a lot since, but I haven't really followed it sufficiently carefully because I'm lazy. But this, I think, was a landmark. Okay, so let's move a little bit to what's happening in the world of large language models and the brain. There's a lot of hype around it. There's several labs that do it. And here's the basic, so, it's like the tasks typically is next word prediction in humans, machines, and brains. So you have some numbers, some values of responses to specific points within a text, tokens or whatever they call it. You have scores that are behavioral scores. You test subjects. You can get behavioral scores. You can get the machine scores. At each point, you can get the machine level of activation for different word embeddings. And you can actually get brain scores if you put the subject in some kind of a machine. EEG, MEG, fMRI, whatever acronyms you can cook up, something. And the idea is to look for correlations. So a successful project, this is the logical structure of this field. A successful project will show you that there are like all kinds of correlations between the three players: humans, machines, and brains. That's the way it works. And then once you got it, you got a paper in Nature. So here's an experiment. It's like a flagship experiment of this community, one of the two flagship experiments. It was done by Ariel Goldstein, he was a student in Jerusalem, and then was a postdoc at Uri Hasson's lab at Princeton. These are supposedly heavy computational people. And what they did is they took, I think, 500 subjects, and they ran them through a text, and they got a correlation between the GPT-2. So at the time, GPT-2 was the only one that was open to, had like open source, so everybody played with GPT-2. I've seen that in the Roni Katzir's lab, they play with GPT-3, and I'm not following this thing every day, so I don't know what's happening in terms of open source and things like that. But basically what they did is they set up a correlation between the values of the predictions of a particular stage in the processing of GPT-2 and the values of some kind of normalized values of human behavior, and the correlation came up quite true. But let's look at the text. It's kind of important to look at the text, okay? And because Uri Hasson, the head of the lab, comes from an ideology that he acquired very mistakenly, in my view, in a lab of a friend of mine, Rafi Malach, at the Weizmann Institute. They have this ideology that what you should do is you should look at language in the wild, okay? So naturalistic text is the only thing that's telling. So controlled experiments is off the table. That's kind of news to me, and the text they used is a very amusing text because it had worked for them before. So Uri's dissertation was on looking at people's brains as they were watching a movie. And the idea was to try to predict when these people are faced with a close-up of a face. So the idea was to predict it straight out of the fMRI signal. I don't understand why they use a movie. You can do a controlled experiment. This is what experiments are controlling for. But no, they decided that, and the decision was well worth it because the movie was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And they got a science paper with Clint Eastwood on the cover or something like this. That was the idea. So now they used a very amusing text from National Public Radio. It's a story that many of you have heard about, how a New Zealandian photographer was in Africa and was taking pictures of gorillas. And at one point, the gorilla grabbed the photographer's cell phone and did a selfie. And this went viral. And then the gorilla sued. So the owners, it's a crazy story. You can find it it's called, what is it called? I forget. You can find it in NPR's on the NPR website. It's a completely crazy story because the owners of the zoo or the park I think it was in South Africa or something. They sued the photographer for copyright. And then the issue is whose copyright is it? Is it the gorilla? So it became a very amusing story, the trial altogether. And this is the story that actually was used by this experiment in order to set up the relationship between humans, machines, and brains. Okay, again, following the same ideology. I don't need to convince you that if you look carefully, I thought I would do it, but then I was a little lazy. Maybe I should now. It's just count the sentence types that are there in the most descriptively stupid way. And I'm sure that you will never find a single question there. If anything, maybe there's a yes/no question. You'll definitely find no WH question, no ellipsis, things like that. Forget it, but that's about what you find. Maybe a relative clause here and there, but that's it. So, training a machine to be able to do this, it's like having an autonomous vehicle driving in a straight line. What's the point? And this is what they did. And then they used the same technique that had been used by the previous experiment that I described, namely looking at epileptic people. I'm not going to give you a whole critique about how bad this experiment is. It's one of the most influential experiments in the past 6 or 7 years. If you count its citations, it's probably 500 or something like this. And so this is the paper, and it's really, if you ask me later, I'll tell you about the techniques, what's flawed in the technique that they used. But they had altogether, pulling together all the electrodes over 9 patients, they had like 1,300, a little bit over 1,300 electrodes, and about 10% of these gave you a significant correlation between the signal intensity and the actual responses of the human subjects. So you can see the picture. You can see they're really spread all over the place, and this is the best resolution that you get for 9 different subjects. There are all kinds of issues with what does it mean, given that brains are different in structure. How do you normalize? But let's forget about that for a second. You can see it's spread all over, and you also only see the left hemisphere. And I hope you can trust me that you can't count 1,300 here. And what that means is that there are quite a few active electrodes on the right hemisphere. They're not shown in this image. They're shown in the paper, but not in this image. So the resolution is below poor. So you don't really get linguistic resolution, and you don't really get anatomical resolution. So this is as good as it gets. Never stops the authors from saying that the speech is similar to autoregressive DLM. Okay, and then there's a second paper that comes out of the lab of F. Fedorenko at MIT. I can show you the stimuli she uses. They're no different than these. Well, a little, but not in a way that improves them in any way. I can show you her stimuli later. And the resolution is very poor. These are inflated brains, so you can see the pieces of cortex which are buried in the subside. So this is what's happening. Nothing much about anatomy, nothing much about language, but sweeping claims. I think there's an alternative. The alternative here, just because I'm a little lazy, I quoted mostly my papers, even though now mine are nuts too, but we're not alone in this business. We're few, but we're not alone. And the evidence is fairly clear that, you get syntactic movement for what used to be called Broca's area, and you get, I think, again, the evidence is kind of not weak, but it's isolated for like Darwin-entailing operators, namely implicit negations, you can call them, or something like that. And what's interesting here is not just that you get a signal, but that the signal you get is in a coherent brain area. So one thing you would expect is that if there's any way to specialize, if you're a piece of brain, you would see it reflected in some anatomical way. And there was a guy whose name you may have heard called Corbinian Brodmann, who lived about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, And his hypothesis was, let's look at the microscope, at the microscopic structure of cortex, and maybe we can identify regions there. How we identify it, I can tell you a long story, it doesn't matter. But the hypothesis was that the coherence of a specific region in terms of the way it looks under the microscope reflects specialized connectivity. And that specialized connectivity is what underlies specialized functions. So that was the idea. So what my lab has been doing for many years now is trying to look at anatomical pieces. They're pretty small, a couple of cubic centimeters or 3-4 cubic centimeters, which is a lot of cells, but it's as small as it gets, and try to see the degree of overlap between what you get functionally and what you get anatomically. So these are, to me, these are the pieces of language, namely the kinds of rule systems that you guys invent, and anatomical pieces, the kinds of things that Catherine Amunds and the rest of my colleagues in Germany discover. And sometimes it so happens that we do it together, namely, in this particular case of the D operators, my team was the first to show the function of an area that had not been described previously through an anatomical map, and it sent them to the microscope, and they actually described, you can see here, you can see the degree of overlap, okay? And I'll tell you why these guys are on the screen. So what you see here are 3 areas. These are the language areas, okay? So these are like Brodmann areas 44 and 45. Now, I will tell you that I once taught a class that had this name because I didn't want anyone to come. And is it true? Am I lying? Okay. So these are the traditional Broca's area, roughly, anatomically scoped. And this is the area that we actually exposed as a functional area, the one that comes in, I don't know what this color is called, violet, magenta, I don't know names of colors in any language, and I'm not colorblind, I'm just ignorant. So whatever this is, purple, I don't know. Whatever this is the functional blob, namely the area that was identified by the function. It's in an anatomical structure that's called the anterior insula on the left side. And this is the identification by the microscopic methods that identify the anatomy. And the interesting thing is, it's not just sitting there arbitrarily. Many people have a finding in an fMRI that nobody else has ever found, and they think they discovered something. Maybe they're right, but you need a little bit more than that. And to us, one of the reasons to believe this is because we sent the anatomists to go fish for it, and it was coherent. And in fact, if you look at the center of mass of these 2 blobs, they're basically sitting on one on top of the other. You can see it here. Maybe in the previous picture, no, you can't see it here. Anyway, so the reason I put up these guys, it's a little bit of a combo between Brodmann, Chomsky, and Bertrand Russell, who were the first to use something called logical forms, so something like that. You want to identify with humans, you have your humans. So this is basically the story, and the summary statement, and I'll stop in just 2 minutes, is that you have a mosaic of pieces of microanatomically parcellated brain modules, what we call cytoarchitecture, namely architecture based on cellular structure. These are the 44 and 45. To get this, it takes a lot of assumptions. I'm willing to spread them out for you from now to tomorrow, and many of them are questionable assumptions, but at least there's something to hang on to. And I hope that the grammatical pieces the language pieces are actually constrained grammatical modules of one sort or another. If there would be 20 other labs that do this kind of stuff, we would be in a better situation. And I'll tell you something about the networks, and I'll tell you a story that I think is very telling. So when I think I was a postdoc or a student, I don't remember, and at MIT, they used to have these like Tuesday night cognitive science seminars. We're talking 1980s something. And there was a cognitive science seminar by a young guy called Jeff Hinton. He was like a assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, and he just came up with a paper on something called Boltzmann machines, which is what he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for. So he was standing there and he was giving a talk and he was really intimidated. And the reason he was intimidated is because there were two very aggressive older men in the audience. One was called Jerry Fodor and the other one was called Daniel Dennett. And they happened to be friends. They're both gone, sadly. But at the time, they happened to be good friends and they were big, both of them were big guys. And they were sitting here and they were sitting next to me, so it's not something I could miss. And they were like whispering to each other and giggling all the time. And he was getting more and more nervous. It was actually very funny. I mean, to me, not to him, he was really getting nervous. This was, I think, a couple of years after Fodor published his book, The Modularity of Mind. So what he did, in the end, he got up, and he was really a big guy, big and a little slouchy. And he said, so what about modularity? Like that, okay? And Hinton immediately said, I have nothing against modularity. As far as I'm concerned, there could be many small modules, each of which is built out of a network. And I never forgot this. I'm sure that today he doesn't believe any of this. Pretty sure he doesn't even remember this particular incident because Fodor just looked at him and said, good, and sat down. Okay, and everybody was laughing. Fodor was a very, very funny man. So I'm almost confident that he doesn't believe in any of this. But to me, it was an eye-opener because at the time, I had no idea about any possible way to think about these brain areas that at the time we used to identify only in aphasic patients with 7 slices of CT. 7 slices. This is what it was. And there was a research assistant sitting with a piece of transparency and copying the borders of the lesion. It was like, but nobody had a way of thinking about what's inside. And I remember that I kept wondering, what can I say about this other than this can give us at best some kind of a descriptive generalization of how things should be partitioned. So like a neurological constraint on what's neurologically feasible. And at the time, you know, my first endeavor was to try to show how you analyze passive. Like, do you analyze all passives alike? Or is there something called move alpha at the time? There was such a rule. But this was as far as anyone could get to. But thinking about some kind of a brain-driven theory, there was just nothing, really nothing. And all of a sudden, this guy comes not with a concrete proposal, but at least with a direction. And I never forgot this. And I think he did. So I think this is just about it. I mean, I can tell you all kinds of other stories, but maybe we should stop. Let's just summarize what we can do for them, because remember, we're doing the Lunar Society. The reason, by the way, it was called the Lunar Society, and they would meet on a full moon night, is that they could come back home. There was no lampposts at the time, so they could come back home and see the road back home. So I think all of us should be preaching for something like this Lunar Society between us and those engineers, and we have things to offer them that maybe the only students are doing to some extent. So we can actually have all kinds of linguistically designed benchmarks. This is what people do. It's like the new tech linguistics, tech psycholinguistics. Let's do experiments with machine, things that people like Tal Linzen do. We can actually try to design linguistically constrained algorithms, you know, that may lead to like more sparse representations in some way or another. We can curate the training sets. Maybe people are doing this kind of thing. You know, we can come up with I don't know how to think about adversarial examples in syntax, but maybe there's a way, you know. And what they can do to us is a lot. And I'm serious, okay? This is really an important new playground to study acquisition and processing. It's like the new tech psycholinguistics. You can really play with it if you take it seriously. And maybe there's a potential for like neural-like implementations. Maybe it's a way of making applied linguistics be serious at last. And finally, and this is important, and I'm not being facetious here, this is extremely important, and we're losing big time. So you'd better wake up, you young people. And yeah, I think we can give up on this. That's it. Okay, Mira.
So I should get much, but I'm thinking, okay, so you said it's small areas, 3 or 4 centimeters. We would have to have the brain the size of, I don't know what, the US. We have so many small little things like downward entailing context. So is it multifunctionality? I mean, could this downward entailing piece of brain also function for my walking straight or what?
Since you equivocated, you could have asked what you equivocated. Let me answer you in a somewhat didactic way. And the didactic way says this: you may be right, but neither you nor I have any evidence. So let's not equivocate to begin with. Maybe you're right. I don't know. But we don't know what it takes in terms of the volume or the number of neurons and the degree of connectivity between them, what it takes in order to compute anything. Well, not quite true, but anything linguistic for sure. And given that we don't know, it's for us to discover. Now, there's a hidden question that you asked that I'm happy to answer, which is about multifunctionality. No, but it may be an unrelated question. It's a very important question, but it may be unrelated. We just don't know. So the other question is, are there really dedicated functions for dedicated brain areas? In some areas of the brain, we know there are, namely in the visual cortex. You go like this. This is not
That's important. No. That's important.
as opposed to language, which is totally unimportant.
No. Downward entailing is a small
But
part.
without downward entailingness, you cannot be a rational person. You see, let me tell you something. No, I'm so glad you asked. Let me tell you. No, let me tell you. No, this is important. I'm sorry, I said I was argumentative, so I am. So let me show you something. You see, on the previous slide, I put up several, this is just a slice of a brain, and you have several areas within this slice. These are the language areas that we know and love, Broca's area. This is the little thingy that has downward entailingness. And it's a shaky result, but it is a result, and I don't know anyone that has managed to show otherwise. No, I'm being apologetic. I suspect my data more than anyone can possibly suspect me. And I also marked something here that's called SING. This SING stands for something called the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is a very big structure. And this big structure is thought to be the place where you do what they call decision making. So decision making is usually done on inferences. And these inferences, all I know, are done on propositions. And propositions have propositional structure. And this propositional structure comes in some language. And what I think is, I think I put it in that paper, what I think is happening here is the following, and I'll give you some suggestive evidence for it. It seems to me that what's happening here, and notice there's a left-right asymmetry here, which is quite surprising, because anatomically there is no asymmetry. If we looked at the anatomy extremely carefully, there is no asymmetry. Functionally, there is. Okay, so I think it's no accident that in fact this little DE area is sitting between the language areas and the decision area. And the reason is exactly the reason why I put Bertrand Russell there. You have to convert sentences into some kind of a logical representation. I happened to find like a teeny tiny clue. It's really a teeny tiny clue. It comes with all kinds of stuff around it, like a lot of behavioral evidence that we have and things like that. But still, it's a teeny tiny clue to something. And it's not accidental that it's here. And moreover, when you start playing with your data, So there are all kinds of games that you can play. One of the most important things you have to be trained with when you do this is thresholding. You can threshold the signal in different ways and at different levels. And one thing that you can see is that the path goes here. The path from here goes here, the functional path. And only from the left, this is what's important, because speaking of multifunctionality, this area of the brain is thought to embed a function that I don't understand. It's called, I always forget the name, the perception of self. What is it called?
Proprioception.
Not proprioception, not proprioception. I always forget the word. It's close to proprioception, but it's not it. It's the perception of self. I don't understand what it means, but what I know is that that function, whose name I don't remember, is bilateral, and the signal does not go there to the anterior cingulate. So you can actually single it out. We don't have this, it's not something we thought about. So it's not like we did it in the same experiment. But there is generalization in this world. And the signal does not go from these two blobs that you see in the normal brain on this functional perception of self. It does not go here. So it's not accidental that this thing is sitting en route between the decision-making areas, which must be on some kind of a positional structure or whatever language there is here, and the linguistic areas. Somebody wants to explore German.
Not at the combination of the location and the path, as you call it, path. So,
Of course,
okay.
of course.
I was looking for something because I was thinking, okay, there'll be 250 dots. That's not enough, okay? But once you
So
get more.
you have a theory about the space that linguistic rules occupy? No, just
I
tell
don't.
me.
I
Again,
don't.
since you're equivocating, the burden is on you, I don't have one.
I don't, but I
Okay,
imagine
just-
that there's.
Just
can be
say,
a
just say.
down
all right.
there, but
I think just a follow-up, it's not a question, just what is really striking about DE is that there is no phonetic, phonological, morphological, syntactic generalization that can capture this concept. It's a purely semantic concept which
Right.
we believe to be universal. All languages have polarity items, all languages use the same mechanism of licensing. And there's just no way you could extract that from the input. There's just no possible. It's like the most extreme case that I know of as a universal concept, language after language. And the licensing is completely divorced from the strings. You don't in conditionals, you get in negative, polarity. If you look at the actual forms of the sentences that license, they look completely different in language.
okay.
So that cannot be extracted from. So finding this in the brain, it's like, yeah, there's something innate. Because
And I don't know if it's innate or not. I don't like getting into the innateness question. I don't know. But one thing I do know is that none of the sentences, this experiment, in this experiment, none of the sentences we used involve negation. This is like to underscore Idan's point. It's not accidental that I didn't call it negation. Actually, the paper is called logical negation because we wanted to be accessible to downloading tailing classes for Journal of Semantics. So the papers that we have on behavior are Journal of Semantics, and we're talking about downloading the tailing class. But when you talk to more scientists, you have to use a vocabulary of a 6-year-old. And it's true. And this is what we did, accepting statistics. All right, yeah.
Thank you, that was really.
Getting close to just because I'm dead.
I think I lost the connection to the LLMs towards the end. So you showed that, this is a question of clarification. So you showed that if you want to get correlation with LLM activations, you lose the resolution and you can't distinguish between function.
No, okay, so thanks for asking. Is that it?
Yeah, I think that's
Okay, thanks for asking. You're right. Now that I think about it, something a little bit confusing. So what I did was I said, look, the only experiments that correlate LLM values, LLM produced values to brain produced values are these. these are just bad experiments. You know, and it's difficult to convince the world, but here it's a little easier. Okay, so this is one thing. Then there's another thing, and the claim here is and I should have clarified it much more, and you're absolutely right. The question is, do you need linguistic generalizations to understand the brain? This is the question. And the answer is, well, give me an alternative. As Idan said, give me an alternative to, how to interpret downward entanglement. You're my guest, instead of, there's no point in insisting on anything. Just give me an alternative. And the answer is, the fact that there is a linguistic generalization only tells you, it doesn't tell you that there are no networks there. Of course, it doesn't tell you anything like that. It just tells you what your theory should be sensitive to. And your theory should be sensitive to these kinds of generalizations, exactly like the result that we previously saw from phonetics. And these guys say it explicitly. Your theory should be sensitive to distinctive features. Honestly, my jaw fell at the time when they sent me this paper. You learn it in like a second lesson of linguistic, Ling 1 or 101, or whatever it's called here. That there's this thing called distinctive features, right? Is that what you teach?
No.
I knew it was, I knew he would say so. But still, there is, it comes later when you tell the word that's wrong. No.
So basically, linguistic theory has been much more effective and successful in allowing us to understand the brain than just using the LLM and reading its activation.
Not even, I'm much more modest, and I'm not saying, I don't know what success is. But seriously, So I'm trying to be as modest as I can about successes. But what I know is that the evidence clearly points to the need of paying attention to these generalizations or coming up with alternative explanations. That's fine too, but give me one. Just show me the money, that's all. And instead, we usually get relevant. That's the only point. So thanks for your question, because I was completely unclear. The switch from these experiments, the bad guys, as it were, to these kinds of experiments is not trivial. And there's a very complicated sociology behind these things that is fairly hostile to what you guys are doing, and you should be aware of that and try to be wise in fighting it off. I'm at the end of my career, but you're just at the beginning, so think about money. Yeah.
One of the points you made was a useful activity would be curating better data sets that are training sets.
Yes.
And I actually found it interesting that you pointed out the lack of WH just questions in this data, I think. Or,
if you look at Ariel Goldstein's,
okay,
if you just listen to this NPR program about the gorilla,
right?
It's
very
it's like maybe one WH question. You can find quite a few relative clauses there, but that's about it. And I think most of them are subject. But
so when I'm thinking of interesting data sets to train on, I understand that one of the challenges that LLMs have is predicting the next back channel, which, predicting would seem to us humans to be one of the most simplistic things you could do. How hard can that be? But it seems to perhaps demand an understanding of where the argumentation is going and where we are in the syntax and so on. So I know
I honestly never looked at AHA, but it's a good point. But the thing is, to their credit, if you look at the quality of text summarization that you get out of them, it's really good. And to do text summarization intelligently, it's difficult. I mean, you should know.
Yeah.
So I don't know about AHA specifically, but we should
I-
give
I'm
them the
thinking-
credit when it's due. These are really amazing things.
I agree, it's just, if we wanna push it forward to getting to a more,
First of all, let's appreciate what's there.
for sure, but how can you get to the more, let's say, the symbolic level that you're interested in, where it could be that even something as silly as a back channel, which seems to have no interesting symbolic structure, presupposes a level of.
I agree.
Yeah.
Look, with any observation you will enlighten, you will accept happily and gratefully. But the question is, what exactly do we do? How do we evaluate that? What's the status of these generalizations within the theory of language? Do they even belong in the theory of language? That's another question, or maybe something more general about like a theory of communication of sorts. Doesn't make it smaller, it just makes it more difficult. But so these are serious questions, I think. And the next one is, how can a machine get it, and what theory we have to guide the machine? These are very serious questions, and I'm not being dismissive the least bit, not at all. It's like many, where I work in Jerusalem, at least I used to work, something like this, but I got engaged with quite a few debates with the neural network theorists. And they educated me because they were battling with me. First and foremost, I think Israel's leading neuroscientist, the guy named Grodzinsky, who won the Brain Prize, which is the highest prize in brain research, and for good reason. And he and a whole bunch of others, we had these like endless arguments, both in person and also in email. And one of the students, a fantastic student, was offended because I called what he does an engineering project. And he was offended, and I was shocked. I could never be an engineer. There's no way I could be an engineer. I don't have what they call sechel for this kind of thing. I could never be an engineer, and it took me forever to try to convince him that it's exactly the opposite. So I repeat it because it's exactly the same. The problems that you're describing are extremely difficult. They're not easy. They're extremely difficult. And give me a good description, and then let's see how they pan out. In somebody's machine. Want to go home?
You don't go home, you go have refreshments upstairs, so. With dry cookies. Thank you, yes.
לא עלית בשבוע שעבר, אבל העוגיות לא יושבות.
אני גם בשבוע שעבר. עלית ואני לא.
עוגיות.
גם אין.
השבוע